Hi, welcome to the object lesson. Now, you might have heard Python or Code Shrew referred to as an object-oriented language before. What does that mean though? What is an object? Well, we've actually already been working with objects, we just didn't call them that before. All the shapes we use, stars, circles, squares, and hearts, are objects. Objects hold data that describes their particular state and abilities. For example, the heart object has data, called attributes, that store its height, width, and color, and you can set these values when you first create the heart, as shown here. Additionally, you have access to these attributes even after creating the heart, allowing you to change them later, as shown here. Now, it is important to note that you are not always able to access all of an object's data, since sometimes it is best to control how these objects are interacted with. We won't get into that in this lesson, but it is something that will come up if you do continue programming. Now, let's take a quick detour before moving forward with our discussion on objects. Consider a blueprint, which are the plans for how a house is to be built. Now, you can use this same blueprint to make many houses, but change things later, like colors you want the walls to be, and where the house is located. Considered this way, a house is like an instance of a blueprint. When it comes to objects, objects are like a house, and a class is like the blueprint for that house. Said differently, an object is an instance of a class. So when we want to create our own objects, we write something called a class that defines the data these objects contain and how they act. A class is a piece of code, like when we wrote functions, and it has its own syntax requirements. Once we write this class, we can make many instances of the class. For example, let's look back at our heart object. We can make many instances of the heart object, all based on the class written for it, but all have their own data, so you can have them each be a different color and size, along with changing other properties. This is a very important aspect of object-oriented programming. Since each of these objects have their own data, we can easily change one without worrying about any of the others being affected. Alright, it's time to create our own classes. Don't worry if this looks confusing at first. It'll make more sense once you see the examples following this. So to start, you want to set up your class with a name, which are usually capitalized. After that, you'll want to define this function called underscore underscore init underscore underscore. This is a special function name, so make sure it has this exact name. This is a function that is automatically called when you create the object and defines the object's default behavior and how it gets set up. Note here, we are also required to pass in a variable called self to this function, which basically means to apply the object's own state so we can modify it and use it as needed. Now, this isn't something that we actually pass in, it's just something that's automatically passed into the function when we use it, and that'll make more sense in a second. In this example, we also choose to pass in the variable a, which is required, and the variable b, which is optional with a default value of 1. These are then taken in to set the object's own x and y values using self.x and self.y to make sure the object's own attributes are set to those values. So let's take a look at an example. Alright, so I wrote a class called animal. This animal has 3 attributes: species, color, and age. As you can see, the species variable is required. Color and age have default values of brown and 2 years, respectively. When we create an animal using this class, we can call it like so. Here, we use the class name, animal, and pass in the required species variable, which we set as dog. Since we don't pass in the color or age, Steve, our dog, is brown. Maybe instead we want Steve to be a 1-month-old cat. We would call it like so. Lastly, as you saw with the heart object, we can change Steve's attributes as shown here, where we can change his age from 1 month to 1 year. Now, what if we want our animal to be able to take the command speak? We can actually add in an additional method called speak that will print out the sound the animal makes. Note that this function also needs self as an input, which is the case for all functions inside a class. So now when we initialize our animal, we are required to pass in both the species name and the sound that species makes. So here I show initializing our animal, Steve, to be a cat that makes the sound meow. In order to make him speak, you would call his speak function as shown here with steve.speak. We could also add another function that changes the object's own attributes. As shown here, we add an additional function called changeToDog, which sets the object species to dog and sound variable to bark. Now, if we initially set Steve's species to cat and sound to meow, but then use its change to dog function, it will now bark when it speaks, since Steve is now a dog. As a final couple of examples, I have modified code we created in the functions lesson. So check out the playground and make sure you understand how this code works. Alright, that's all for now. Objects are definitely very complex, so don't worry if it's still unclear how to use them. Check out the playground and experiment with the examples until you're comfortable with them. See you next time!